The chlorine stung Maya Chen's eyes as she surfaced from the murky depths of the Naval Special Warfare Training Pool, her lungs burning with the sweet ache of oxygen deprivation. Around her, 12 Navy SEALs stood in stunned silence, their stopwatches still ticking in disbelief. What had started as a cruel joke, a bet that the desk jockey couldn't even swim a single lap, had just turned into something none of them could explain. 18 minutes, 47 seconds, whispered Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, his weathered face pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the Coronado training facility. The previous underwater endurance record, held by his own team for 3 years, had been shattered by a woman they'd dismissed as just another Pentagon analyst. That's not possible. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Maya floated there, treading water with an eerie calm that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than mere physical conditioning. Her dark hair clung to her shoulders like seaweed, and her slight frame, barely 5'4" and maybe 120 pounds, looked almost ethereal against the institutional blue of the pool tiles. But it was her eyes that unsettled them most. Dark, ancient eyes that seemed to hold secrets the ocean had whispered to her alone. The bet had started 3 hours earlier in the mess hall, where Maya sat alone with her regulation tray of scrambled eggs and coffee that had gone cold while she reviewed classified submarine reconnaissance reports. She was there as part of a joint intelligence assessment, one of those Washington assignments that put civilians alongside military personnel for enhanced operational understanding. The SEALs had been watching her for days, this quiet woman, who seemed to glide rather than walk, who spoke in measured sentences that somehow commanded attention despite their softness. "Look at her," Staff Sergeant Danny Morrison had muttered to his teammates, gesturing with his fork toward Maya's table. "Probably never even been in a pool, let alone the ocean. These intel types, they think warfare happens on computer screens." His words carried the bitter edge of men who'd lost friends in waters that didn't care about theoretical knowledge or classified clearances. Rodriguez had tried to quiet the younger man, but Morrison was already standing, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound like fingernails on chalkboard. The mess hall fell quiet as he approached Maya's table, his 6'2" frame casting a shadow across her paperwork. "Ma'am," Morrison had said, his voice carrying that particular military courtesy that barely concealed contempt. "We were wondering if you might join us for some practical training this afternoon. You know, get your feet wet, so to speak." The laughter from his table was sharp and ugly, the kind that turns stomachs and hardens hearts. Maya had looked up slowly, setting down her pen with the careful precision of someone who had learned to measure every movement. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, yet it somehow filled the entire hall. "What kind of training, Sergeant Morrison?" The use of his name, which she'd never been told, sent a ripple of unease through the room. Morrison's swagger faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Swimming, ma'am. Basic water survival. We thought maybe you'd like to see how the real military trains." Maya had studied his face for a long moment, and those who were watching would later swear they saw something shift in her expression, not anger, but something deeper and more unsettling. Like the surface of a calm ocean just before a storm reveals its true nature. "I'd like that very much," she had said finally, and Morrison's grin had spread across his face like spilled oil. Now, 3 hours later, that grin was nowhere to be found. Morrison stood at the edge of the pool, his face ashen, staring at the woman who had just rewritten everything they thought they knew about human endurance. The bet had been simple. If Maya could swim 10 laps without stopping, they'd treat her with the respect due a fellow professional. If she couldn't when she couldn't, she'd agree to request a transfer back to Washington and stop playing soldier with the real warriors. What had followed defied every principle of physiology and human limitation they'd been taught. Maya had slipped into the water with the fluid grace of something born to it, her movements so natural they seemed choreographed by the water itself. She'd completed the 10 laps in under 6 minutes, her stroke technique flawless despite never having attended formal swimming instruction according to her military records. But she hadn't stopped there. "Why isn't she coming up?" Petty Officer Sarah Kim had asked after Maya disappeared beneath the surface for the 5th time. Kim was the only other woman present, a combat medic whose own swimming credentials were impressive by any standard. She'd been quietly rooting for Maya from the beginning, though she'd never admit it to her male colleagues. The minutes had stretched like taffy, each second marked by the soft hum of the pool's filtration system and the nervous shuffling of combat boots on wet concrete. At 10 minutes, Rodriguez had moved to the pool's edge, ready to dive in for a rescue. At 15 minutes, he'd activated the emergency protocols, alerting the medical team and preparing diving equipment. At 18 minutes and 47 seconds, Maya had surfaced on her own, her breathing steady and controlled, as if she'd simply been taking a casual underwater stroll rather than pushing the absolute limits of human survival. "How?" Rodriguez asked now, his voice hoarse with disbelief. The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, yet equally impossible to answer. Maya pulled herself from the pool with movements that seemed to flow like water itself, her feet finding purchase on the wet tiles without the slightest slip or stumble. She reached for her towel, a simple white military issue rectangle that she wrapped around her shoulders like a ceremonial robe. "My grandmother used to say that the ocean doesn't lie," Maya said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence of the training facility. "It shows you exactly who you are, without pretense or protection. Today, it showed you something you weren't ready to see." Corporal James "Tank" Washington, who'd earned his nickname by surviving an IED blast that would have killed lesser men, took a step back from the pool's edge. At 6'6" and 250 pounds of solid muscle, he'd never backed down from anything in his life. But something about Maya's presence now, the way she seemed to command the very air around her, made him feel like a child who'd wandered too far from shore. "What are you?" he whispered, and immediately regretted the question. It sounded foolish and superstitious, the kind of thing his grandmother might have asked about the strange lights she claimed to see dancing over the bayou back in Louisiana. Maya's smile was sad and ancient, holding depths that none of them could fathom. "I'm exactly what I appear to be, Corporal Washington. A woman who's learned that the ocean keeps its own counsel, and sometimes shares its secrets with those who listen carefully enough to hear them." She began walking toward the locker rooms, her wet feet leaving prints on the concrete that seemed to shimmer in the harsh light. But she paused at the doorway, turning back to face the assembled SEALs who still stood frozen in their disbelief. "The bet," she said softly. "What were the terms if I won?" Morrison cleared his throat, his voice cracking like a teenager's. We didn't think. I mean, we never discussed." "Then let me suggest terms," Maya interrupted, though her tone remained gentle. "Respect works both ways, gentlemen. And understanding runs deeper than you might think. Tomorrow morning, 0500, I'd like to show you something. Something about the water that might change how you think about your own limitations." She disappeared into the locker room, leaving behind only the echo of her words and the lingering scent of seawater impossible. Considering they were 50 yards from the Pacific and the pool contained nothing but chlorinated fresh water, Rodriguez was the first to find his voice. "Did anyone else smell salt?" Kim finished, her medical training warring with instincts that went back to childhood stories told by her Korean grandmother about women who could breathe underwater and speak with the spirits of drowned sailors. The Korean grandmother about women who could breathe underwater and speak with the spirits of drowned sailors. SEALs stood in the empty training facility long after Maya had left, each lost in their own thoughts, trying to reconcile what they'd witnessed with everything they thought they knew about the world. The pool's surface had returned to its artificial calm, but somehow it looked different now, deeper, more mysterious, as if Maya's presence had awakened something that had been sleeping beneath the chlorinated surface. Out in the distance, the Pacific Ocean called with its eternal voice, and for the first time in their military careers, every man and woman in that room wondered if they'd been swimming in the shallows their entire lives. Maya Chen's alarm never had a chance to sound. At 0430 hours, she'd been awake since 3, sitting cross-legged on her narrow bunk in the visiting officer's quarters, watching the pre-dawn darkness through her small window. The base was quiet except for the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore, a rhythm that matched the steady beating of her heart, as if the ocean were calling her home. Her quarters were Spartanly functional, regulation furniture, white walls, and fluorescent lighting that she kept dimmed to a soft glow. On her small desk sat 3 items that told the story of a life lived between 2 worlds. The first was her security badge, with its official Pentagon photograph, showing a woman with serious dark eyes and conservative black hair, pulled into a neat bun, the image of a competent intelligence analyst who specialized in underwater reconnaissance and submarine warfare patterns. The second was her laptop, its screensaver rotating through satellite images of ocean floors, thermal readings from deep-sea currents, and classified reports that tracked the movement of foreign submarines through waters most people would never see. Maya knew these depths not just through technology and intelligence briefings, but through something deeper, an understanding that had been passed down through generations of women who'd made their peace with the sea. The third item would have surprised anyone who thought they knew Maya Chen. It was a small jade pendant, carved in the shape of a diving woman, her arms outstretched and her hair flowing behind her like underwater grass. The pendant had belonged to her grandmother and her grandmother's grandmother, stretching back through a lineage of women whose relationship with water defied conventional explanation. Maya lifted the pendant now, feeling its familiar weight against her palm. The jade was warm despite the cool morning air, and she could almost hear her grandmother's voice echoing across the years. Mei Lin, her grandmother had called her by her Chinese name. You come from the Pearl River Delta, where our ancestors learned that survival meant understanding the water's moods better than your own heartbeat. The ocean recognizes its own children, no matter how far they wander from home. Growing up in San Francisco's Chinatown, Maya had thought her grandmother's stories were just that, stories. Tales of women who could hold their breath for impossible lengths, who could navigate treacherous currents by feel alone, who could sense storms coming days before the weather services issued warnings. It wasn't until Maya's first assignment, analyzing sonar readings from submarine patrols, that she'd realized her grandmother's fairy tales were something else entirely. She'd been sitting in a Pentagon basement, surrounded by monitors displaying acoustic signatures from the South China Sea, when something had shifted in her perception. The sound patterns weren't just data points anymore. They were voices, telling stories of thermal layers and current flows, of hiding places and hunting grounds that submarines used like predatory fish. She'd begun writing analysis reports that went far beyond the technical specifications, reports that predicted submarine movements with uncanny accuracy. Her superiors had noticed. Within 6 months, she'd been reassigned to the Naval Intelligence Division's most classified underwater reconnaissance program. Within a year, she'd become the Pentagon's leading expert on submarine behavior patterns in contested waters. And now, 3 years later, she was here in Coronado, supposedly conducting routine intelligence assessments, while secretly investigating reports of anomalous underwater activities that defied conventional military explanation. Maya rose from her bunk and began her morning routine, a series of breathing exercises her grandmother had taught her, disguised as meditation but serving a far more practical purpose. Each breath cycle slowed her heart rate, increased her lung capacity, and activated physiological responses that most Western medicine insisted were impossible. Her grandmother had called it finding the pearl of breath, the place where air and water became one, where the boundaries between self and sea dissolved. At 0445, Maya dressed in standard military physical training gear, navy blue shorts, gray t-shirt, and running shoes that she knew she wouldn't need for what she had planned. She made her way through the quiet base toward the training facility, passing the early morning shift changes and the dedicated few who were already beginning their pre-dawn workouts. The pool building was empty when she arrived, its lights still dimmed for night operations. Maya let herself in with her security badge and stood for a moment in the cavernous space, breathing in the familiar scent of chlorine and concrete. But underneath those artificial smells, she detected something else, the lingering presence of salt water that shouldn't have existed, the ghost of an ocean that was calling its daughter home. She walked to the pool's edge and knelt, placing her palm flat against the water's surface. The chlorinated liquid was cool against her skin, but Maya felt something deeper currents and temperatures and pressures that spoke of vast depths and ancient secrets. The pool's artificial boundaries seemed to dissolve, and for a moment she could feel the Pacific Ocean stretching beyond the walls, its infinite expanse calling to something primal in her blood. "You're here early." Maya turned to find Chief Rodriguez standing in the doorway, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. He'd obviously slept poorly, if at all, and his usual command presence seemed diminished in the gray morning light. "I wanted to prepare," Maya said simply, standing and drying her hand on her towel. "What I'm going to show you and your team, it requires the right conditions." Rodriguez approached slowly, as if the pool might suddenly reveal hidden dangers. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about yesterday, about what we saw. My medical training says what you did was impossible. Humans can't hold their breath for 18 minutes. The human brain can't function without oxygen for that long, and yet I did," Maya finished gently. "Chief, how long have you been diving?" 22 years, ma'am. Open water, technical diving, combat operations. I've logged more hours underwater than some fish." Maya smiled at his attempt at humor, but her eyes remained serious. "In all those years, have you ever felt like the water was trying to tell you something? Like there were patterns and currents that your instruments couldn't detect, but your body somehow knew?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his weathered features reflecting some internal struggle. "There was a mission," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 6 years ago, off the coast of Somalia, we were conducting underwater reconnaissance, and I got separated from my team in zero visibility conditions. My compass was spinning, my depth gauge was malfunctioning, and I was running low on air." He paused, staring into the pool, as if it might hold answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask. "I should have surfaced immediately, called for extraction. But something told me to go deeper. Against every principle of diving safety, against my training, against common sense. I went deeper, and I found my team trapped in an underwater cave system that hadn't appeared on any of our charts. If I hadn't followed that instinct, if I hadn't listened to something that made no logical sense, 3 good men would have died that day." Maya nodded, recognizing the conflict in his voice. "The ocean speaks to those who are willing to listen, Chief, but in your world, in the military, instinct gets labeled as luck or coincidence. There's no room for abilities that can't be quantified or replicated. Is that what this is about?" Rodriguez asked. "Some kind of ability?" Before Maya could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the building. The rest of the SEAL team was arriving for their promised demonstration, their voices carrying a mixture of curiosity and skepticism that Maya had expected. She watched as they filed into the pool area. Morrison, with his barely concealed hostility, Kim with her medical curiosity, Tank Washington with his unsettled wariness, and the others whose names she'd memorized along with their service records and psychological profiles. "Gentlemen, Miss Kim," Maya said as they assembled around the pool, Thank you for coming. I know yesterday raised questions that your training doesn't provide answers for. I'd like to show you something that might help you understand." Morrison stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we've been thinking about this all night. What we saw yesterday, ... There has to be an explanation. Maybe you've been training in secret. Maybe you've got some kind of medical condition that affects your oxygen metabolism. But there's got to be a rationale." "There is," Maya interrupted, her voice carrying across the water with surprising authority. "The explanation is that human beings are capable of far more than your military manuals suggest. But only when we stop fighting against our nature and start working with it." She walked to a nearby equipment locker and withdrew several items: a military-grade underwater timer, a pulse oximeter, and a waterproof camera. "I'm going to ask Chief Rodriguez to monitor my vital signs. Ms. Kim, I'd like you to document everything from a medical perspective. The rest of you, I want you to simply observe and think about what you see in terms of your own limitations." Maya clipped the pulse oximeter to her finger, showing the assembled team the steady reading: 68 beats per minute, oxygen saturation at 99%. Normal resting vitals for someone in good physical condition. "Chief, please start your timer." "When I submerge." She stood at the pool's edge, and something in her posture changed. The nervous energy that had characterized her movements before seemed to drain away, replaced by a stillness that was almost otherworldly. Her breathing deepened and slowed, each inhalation drawing in just air, but something else, a sense of connection that seemed to stretch far beyond the confines of the chlorinated pool. "My grandmother used to tell me that water remembers everything," Maya said, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that seemed to match the gentle lapping of water against the pool's sides. Every raindrop that fell on the mountains, every stream that carried it to the rivers, every river that delivered it to the sea. Water remembers the touch of every creature that ever swam in it, every ship that ever sailed on it, every person who ever trusted their life to its depths." She closed her eyes and continued her breathing cycle, and those watching could see her pulse rate dropping on the oximeter display: 65, 60, 55, 50. The medical impossibility of what they were witnessing should have been alarming, but somehow it felt natural, like watching a master craftsman at work with tools that existed beyond conventional understanding. "In the Pearl River Delta, where my family comes from, there are women called the tanka boat people who spend their entire lives on the water. They can dive to depths that would crush ordinary lungs, hold their breath for times that would kill ordinary people. But they're not superhuman. They simply understand something about the relationship between human consciousness and water that the modern world has forgotten." Maya's pulse rate continued to drop: 45, 40, 35. Kim stepped forward, her medical training screaming that what she was witnessing was impossible, that human consciousness couldn't function at such low heart rates. "Ma'am," Kim said urgently, "your heart rate is approaching levels that would normally indicate peace." Maya said softly, opening her eyes to reveal pupils that seemed to reflect depths far greater than the pool could contain. "I'm not dying. Ms. Kim, I'm simply remembering how to live underwater." She slipped into the pool with movements that seemed to flow like liquid themselves, her entry creating barely a ripple on the surface. The pulse oximeter continued to function, its waterproof housing transmitting data to the poolside monitor, where her vital signs painted a picture that challenged every principle of human physiology. Rodriguez started his timer as Maya disappeared beneath the surface, her form becoming a shadow that moved with impossible grace through the chlorinated depths. But this time was different from their previous observation. Maya wasn't simply holding her breath and waiting, she was moving, swimming, conducting what looked like an underwater dance that seemed to transform the artificial pool into something wild and primal. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Maya's heart rate had stabilized at an impossible 28 beats per minute, while her oxygen saturation held steady at levels that should have indicated brain death. Kim found herself checking and rechecking the equipment, certain that some malfunction was producing impossible readings. At 23 minutes, Maya surfaced in the center of the pool, her breathing steady and controlled, her eyes clear and focused. The pulse oximeter showed her heart rate climbing steadily back toward normal ranges: 35, 45, 55, 68. It was as if her body were a sophisticated machine that could shift between operational modes as easily as changing gears in a vehicle. How? Tank Washington asked, his voice small in the cavernous space. The giant of a man had pressed himself against the far wall, as if distance might provide some protection from what he couldn't understand. Maya floated in the center of the pool, her presence seeming to fill the entire space despite her small stature. Because I stopped fighting the water and started listening to it instead. Because I remembered that human beings evolved from the ocean, and our bodies still carry the memory of those depths. Because I learned to trust something deeper than fear. She swam to the pool's edge and pulled herself out, water cascading from her form like a baptism in reverse. Each of you has felt it during your diving operations, moments when instinct superseded training, when you knew things about the water that your instruments couldn't tell you, when you survived situations that should have been fatal because something deeper than conscious thought guided your actions. Rodriguez nodded slowly, his expression troubled. The Somalia mission. Was you listening to the same voice I hear? Maya finished. The ocean doesn't play favorites, Chief. It speaks to anyone willing to listen. But your training, your culture, your understanding of human limitations, all of it tells you to ignore that voice, to trust machines and protocols instead of the wisdom your ancestors carried in their bones. Morrison stepped forward, his skepticism warring with the evidence of his own eyes. You're talking about what? Some kind of psychic connection to water? That's not science, ma'am. That's mysticism. Maya studied his face with something approaching compassion. Sergeant Morrison, what's your longest combat dive time? 47 minutes, ma'am, with full technical gear and mixed breathing gases. And without gear? Just breath holding? Morrison's jaw tightened. 6 minutes, 30 seconds. That's close to the Navy record for unassisted dives. Yesterday, I held my breath for 18 minutes. Today, 23. Tomorrow, if you're willing to learn, I can teach you techniques that will double your current capabilities. Not through mysticism or magic, but through understanding principles of human physiology and consciousness that your training manuals haven't caught up to yet. She reached for her towel, wrapping it around her shoulders like a ceremonial robe. The choice is yours, all of yours. You can dismiss what you've seen as impossible, file reports that explain away the unexplainable, and continue operating within the limitations you've been taught to accept. Or you can consider the possibility that human potential extends far beyond what you've been told, and that the ocean has been waiting for you to remember who you really are. Maya began walking toward the exit, but paused when Kim called after her. Ma'am, from a medical perspective, what you've demonstrated shouldn't be possible, but I've seen the data. I've witnessed the impossible. If you're willing to teach us ... if you're really offering to share these techniques. Maya turned back, and her smile held depths that seemed to reflect the ocean itself. Miss Kim, the techniques I can teach you, but the real learning? That comes from understanding that the water isn't your enemy to be conquered or your tool to be mastered. It's your ancestor, your teacher, your partner in a dance that began when life first crawled from the primordial seas. When you understand that relationship, everything else becomes possible. She left them standing around the pool, each lost in their own thoughts, trying to reconcile what they'd witnessed with everything they thought they knew about human limitation and possibility. The artificial boundaries of the training facility, seemed somehow smaller now, as if Maya's demonstration had opened windows to vast spaces that extended far beyond the concrete walls dotting the growing morning light. The Pacific Ocean called with its eternal voice, and for the first time in their military careers, every person in that room began to wonder if they'd been swimming in the shallows of their own potential their entire lives. The first sign of trouble came during the morning briefing session in Conference Room Charlie, where Maya had been scheduled to present her intelligence assessment to Admiral Harrison Blackwood, the base commander whose reputation for aggressive skepticism preceded him like a storm front. Blackwood was a man carved from the same stone as the Naval Academy that had produced him, angular, uncompromising, and utterly convinced that military discipline could solve any problem the world might present. Maya entered the briefing room at precisely 0800 hours, her presentation materials organized with the same meticulous care that characterized everything she did. But the atmosphere in the room immediately set her on edge. Instead of the usual complement of intelligence officers and technical analysts, she found herself facing a panel that looked more like a military tribunal. Admiral Blackwood at the head of the table, flanked by Colonel Janet Stevens from Naval Criminal Investigative Service, Commander Michael Torres from Fleet Medical, and Captain Robert Chen from Naval Intelligence, a man whose shared surname with Maya was purely coincidental, but somehow made his presence feel like a personal betrayal. "Miss Chen," Admiral Blackwood began without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of naval command, "we've received some interesting reports about your extracurricular activities at our training facility." Maya set her briefcase down carefully, her expression giving nothing away. "Sir, I was invited to participate in training exercises by members of SEAL Team 7. I assumed this was part of the inter-service cooperation outlined in my assignment orders." Colonel Stevens leaned forward, her sharp features set in the kind of expression that had made her legendary among military prosecutors. "Miss Chen, let me read you some quotes from the preliminary reports we've received. Demonstrated impossible. Underwater endurance capabilities. Exhibited physiological responses that contradict established medical science. Claimed ancestral knowledge of supernatural aquatic abilities. Would you like to comment on these characterizations?" The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of training exercises from the base's various facilities. Maya felt the weight of their collective skepticism like a physical presence pressing down on her shoulders with the accumulated force of institutional doubt. "Colonel Stevens," Maya said carefully, "I demonstrated breathing and diving techniques that I learned from my grandmother, who learned them from her grandmother. These are traditional practices from the Pearl River Delta region of China, where people have been free diving for pearls and food for over 2,000 years. There's nothing supernatural about techniques that have been passed down through generations of maritime communities." Commander Torres consulted his tablet, his medical credentials lending weight to his obvious discomfort with Maya's explanations. "Ms. Chen, according to the physiological data collected yesterday, you sustained a heart rate of 28 beats per minute while maintaining full consciousness and motor function. The medical literature clearly states that human brain function begins to deteriorate at heart rates below 40 beats per minute. What you're claiming to have done is, quite simply, impossible." Maya met his gaze steadily. "Commander, have you ever studied the diving physiology of the Bajau people of Southeast Asia? They've been documented holding their breath for over 30 minutes while diving to depths of 200 feet, using only traditional techniques. Their physiological adaptations include enlarged spleens, increased red blood cell counts, and modified autonomic nervous system responses that allow them to function at heart rates that Western medicine considers incompatible with consciousness." Captain Chen cleared his throat, his discomfort with the situation evident in his body language. As the only other person of Asian descent in the room, Maya could sense his struggle between professional skepticism and cultural understanding. Ms. Chen, while I respect traditional practices, we're dealing with classified military operations here. Your security clearance and your position require that we maintain the highest standards of rational, evidence-based assessment. Claims about ancestral abilities and supernatural diving techniques don't meet those standards. Admiral Blackwood stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo Maya's growing sense of isolation. Miss Chen, let me be frank. We've had reports of you making claims about communicating with water, about hearing voices from the ocean, about possessing abilities that transcend normal human limitations. In the context of a military base with access to classified submarine technology and underwater reconnaissance capabilities, these reports raise serious questions about your psychological stability and security reliability. Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach, a recognition that the demonstration she'd thought would build bridges had instead constructed walls. Admiral, I never claimed to communicate with water or hear voices. I demonstrated traditional diving techniques and tried to share knowledge that could enhance the underwater capabilities of your personnel. If my words were misunderstood or taken out of context, ma'am, interrupted Colonel Stevens, we have 12 witnesses, including several highly trained Special Forces personnel, who observed you performing feats that contradict established principles of human physiology. We have medical data that shows impossible vital sign readings. And we have reports of you making statements about ancestral memories and oceanic connections that, frankly, sound like the delusions of someone experiencing a psychological break. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to dispel with logic or evidence. Maya realized that she had fundamentally miscalculated the military mindset, where she had hoped to find curiosity about human potential. She had instead encountered an institutional framework that demanded conformity to established limitations. Furthermore, Admiral Blackwood continued, returning to his seat with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to being the final authority in any room. Your presence here has created what can only be described as a disruption of unit cohesion and military discipline. Several members of SEAL Team 7 have requested transfers to other units. Others have submitted reports expressing concerns about their own mental state and questioning their previous underwater experiences. This is not the kind of influence we can allow to continue unchecked. Maya's hands remained folded in her lap, but something in her posture shifted. The quiet compliance that had characterized her demeanor began to give way to something deeper, not anger, but a kind of profound disappointment that seemed to fill the room like water finding its level. Admiral, she said quietly, may I ask what outcome you're hoping to achieve with this meeting? Blackwood exchanged glances with his colleagues before answering. Ms. Chen, we're recommending that you be transferred back to Pentagon duty immediately. Your security clearance will be reviewed, and you'll be required to undergo psychological evaluation to determine your fitness for continued service in sensitive intelligence positions. Additionally, you'll be required to sign non-disclosure agreements regarding any activities that took place during your assignment here. And if I refuse? Colonel Stevens smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Miss Chen, you're not in a position to refuse. Your assignment here is terminated as of this moment. You have 24 hours to complete your departure procedures and remove yourself from this facility. Maya stood slowly, her movements carrying the same fluid grace that had so unsettled the SEALs during her pool demonstration. But now that grace seemed somehow threatening to the assembled officers, as if her very presence challenged the fundamental assumptions that underpinned their worldview. I understand, Maya said simply. May I ask one question before I go? Admiral. Blackwood nodded curtly. In your years of naval service, have any of you ever experienced something that your training couldn't explain? A moment when instinct superseded protocol, when you knew something that your instruments couldn't tell you, When you survived a situation that should have been fatal because something deeper than conscious thought guided your actions. The question hung in the air, and Maya could see the flicker of recognition in their eyes, memories of close calls and impossible survivals. Moments when the ocean had spoken in a language older than military manuals. Commander Torres was the first to look away. Captain Chen studied his hands with sudden intensity. Even Colonel Stephen seemed to find something fascinating about her legal pad that required immediate attention. Only Admiral Blackwood held Maya's gaze, and she could see in his weathered features the echo of storms survived and depths navigated. By more than just technological prowess. But his voice, when it came, carried the weight of institutional authority that could not afford to acknowledge what it could not control. "Miss Chen, you're dismissed." Maya gathered her materials and walked toward the door, but paused with her hand on the handle. "Admiral, the ocean doesn't recognize military rank or security clearances. It speaks to those who are willing to listen, regardless of their institutional affiliations. The knowledge I tried to share, it's not going anywhere. It will still be there when your personnel are ready to receive it." She left the room without waiting for a response, closing the door behind her with the soft finality of a wave returning to the sea. But Maya's departure from the briefing room marked the beginning rather than the end of the conflict that would ultimately transform naval special warfare. Command's understanding of human potential and the mysteries that lay beneath the waves they had dedicated their lives to mastering. Within an hour of the meeting's conclusion, Chief Rodriguez had requested an emergency session with Admiral Blackwood. He arrived at the commander's office with a file folder containing incident reports, medical documentation, and video footage that painted a picture far more complex than the simple narrative of psychological instability that the morning's tribunal had constructed. "Admiral," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the weight of 22 years of military service and underwater operations, "I need to brief you on some information that wasn't included in this morning's discussion." Blackwood looked up from the paperwork that seemed to multiply exponentially with each passing year of command responsibility. "Chief, if this is about Miss Chen's departure, the matter has been decided. She represents a security risk and a disruptive influence that we cannot afford to." "Sir," Rodriguez interrupted, something he had never done in his entire military career. "With respect, I think you need to see this." He placed the file folder on Blackwood's desk and opened it to reveal a series of photographs that had been taken during routine underwater reconnaissance missions over the past 3 years. Each image showed anomalous sonar readings, unexplained current patterns, and acoustic signatures that didn't match any known submarine or marine life classifications. "These are from Operation Deep Current, sir. The joint intelligence assessment that brought Miss Chen here in the first place. She wasn't just conducting routine evaluations, Admiral. She was investigating underwater phenomena that our best analysts couldn't explain." Blackwood studied the photographs with growing unease. Each image told a story of encounters with something that defied conventional military understanding, submarine context that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Acoustic signatures that seemed to respond to human presence, current patterns that shifted in ways that suggested intelligence rather than random oceanographic activity. "What exactly are you telling me, Chief?" Rodriguez opened to another section of the file, revealing Maya's analysis reports. Unlike the dry, technical language typical of intelligence assessments, these documents read like poetry written in the vocabulary of warfare descriptions of underwater encounters that captured not just the technical specifications, but the emotional and psychological impact on the personnel who experienced them. "Sir, Ms. Chen's predictions about submarine movements have been 97% accurate over the past 3 years. She's identified hostile underwater activities that our most sophisticated sonar systems missed completely. And she's done it by analyzing patterns that she claims to feel rather than calculate. Blackwood set down the photographs and studied his chief petty officer with growing concern. "Chief, are you telling me you believe in her claims about supernatural abilities?" "Sir, I'm telling you that yesterday I watched a woman demonstrate capabilities that saved my team's lives 6 years ago in Somalia. The instincts I followed that day, the impossible knowledge that led me to my trapped teammates, I recognize it now. Ms. Chen isn't claiming to have supernatural powers. She's demonstrating techniques for accessing human potential that we've been trained to ignore." The Admiral was quiet for a long moment, his career-long commitment to rational military discipline warring with the evidence spread across his desk. "Chief, even if what you're saying is true, we can't build military policy around intuition and ancestral knowledge. We need protocols, procedures, measurable and repeatable results." "Sir, what if those protocols and procedures are limiting our effectiveness rather than enhancing it? What if our insistence on technological solutions is blinding us to capabilities that could save lives and complete missions that conventional approaches can't handle?" Before Blackwood could respond, his aide knocked on the door with an urgency that suggested immediate crisis rather than routine administrative business. "Sir," the young ensign said breathlessly, "we have a situation developing in the training facility. You need to see this immediately." The three men rushed through the base corridors toward the pool building, where they found a crowd of personnel gathered outside the main entrance. Through the windows, they could see the interior space filled with an impossible sight. Every member of SEAL Team 7 standing chest-deep in the training pool, their eyes closed, their breathing synchronized, in a rhythm that seemed to match the distant sound of ocean waves. "What the hell is going on here?" Blackwood demanded of the senior petty officer maintaining crowd control. "Sir, it started about 30 minutes ago. Staff Sergeant Morrison went to the pool for individual training, and then the others started arriving one by one. They won't respond to verbal commands, sir. It's like they're in some kind of trance." Admiral Blackwood pushed through the crowd and entered the pool building. Rodriguez closed behind him. The sight that greeted them challenged every assumption about military discipline and individual autonomy that had defined their understanding of proper soldier behavior. Morrison stood in the center of the group, his usual aggressive demeanor replaced by an expression of profound peace. His breathing was deep and slow, his heart rate visible in the steady pulse at his throat, running far slower than normal human physiology would suggest. Around him, the other team members had arranged themselves in a rough circle, their own breathing synchronized to match his rhythm. "Sergeant Morrison," Blackwood called out, his command voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Report." Morrison's eyes opened slowly, but his gaze seemed focused on something far beyond the confines of the pool building. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying an otherworldly calm, "I can hear it now. The voice that saved Chief Rodriguez in Somalia, the current that guided Tank Washington through the cave system in the Philippines, the instinct that kept Sarah Kim alive during that underwater mine disposal in the Arabian Gulf." Kim nodded from her position in the circle, her medical training apparently unable to explain what she was experiencing. "Admiral, for the first time in my career, I understand what Ms. Chen was trying to tell us. We've been fighting against our own capabilities instead of learning to use them." Tank Washington, the giant who had seemed so unsettled by Maya's demonstration the day before, spoke without opening his eyes. "Sir, I've been diving for 15 years, and I never realized I was holding my breath wrong. I was trying to control the water instead of letting it teach me. Ms. Chen showed us that we've been swimming upstream our entire careers." Blackwood felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's temperature. How long have they been like this? The senior petty officer checked his watch. 37 minutes, sir. None of them has surfaced for air in that entire time. "That's impossible," Commander Torres said from behind them. He had arrived with the crowd of onlookers and was now staring at his medical instruments in disbelief. I'm reading heart rates between 25 and 30 beats per minute across the entire team. They should be unconscious. They should be brain dead. But even as he spoke, the SEALs began to move. Not with the mechanical precision of military drill, but with the fluid grace that Maya had demonstrated, movements that seemed to flow like water itself, transforming the chlorinated pool into something wild and primal. They were practicing underwater maneuvers without breathing apparatus, holding their breath for impossible lengths while conducting complex tactical operations. Morrison demonstrated underwater knot tying that would normally require surface intervals for air. Kim performed underwater medical procedures that should have been impossible without breathing equipment. Washington moved through the water with a speed and grace that made his massive frame seem weightless. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly, "they're demonstrating capabilities that could revolutionize underwater special operations. Instead of being limited by breathing equipment and surface intervals, they're operating underwater like it's their natural environment." Admiral Blackwood watched the impossible display with growing understanding of the choice that lay before him. He could continue to insist on conventional limitations, ordering the team to surface and reporting the incident as a group psychological break requiring immediate intervention. Or he could acknowledge that he was witnessing the emergence of capabilities that could transform naval special warfare in ways that conventional technology never could. The decision was made for him when alarms began sounding throughout the base. Specific pattern that indicated an underwater emergency in the harbor beyond the training facility. "Sir," the watch officer's voice crackled over the communication system, "we have a submarine in distress approximately 2 miles offshore. Unknown classification, possibly foreign, definitely in trouble. Standard rescue protocols are ineffective due to depth and current conditions." Blackwood looked at the SEALs in the pool, then at Rodriguez, then at the growing crowd of personnel who had witnessed the impossible. "Chief, how quickly can your team be ready for underwater rescue operations?" Morrison surfaced fully for the first time in nearly an hour, his breathing steady and controlled despite the extended submersion. "Sir, we're ready now, but we need Ms. Chen. Ms. Chen is being transferred back to Washington under disciplinary action." "Then you're sending us into a rescue operation without our most qualified underwater specialist," Kim said, her medical training warring with her newfound understanding of human potential. "Sir, whatever disciplinary issues exist, people are dying out there. Ms. Chun's capabilities could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." Blackwood felt the weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. Every principle of military discipline demanded that he proceed with conventional rescue protocols, using established procedures and technologies that offered predictable, if limited, outcomes. But the evidence before his eyes suggested that conventional approaches might not be sufficient for the crisis developing beneath the waves. "Get me Ms. Chen," he said finally. "And God help us all if this goes wrong." But even as the base mobilized for emergency response, deeper currents were already in motion. The submarine crisis was not the random mechanical failure it appeared to be, but rather the first visible sign of an underwater conflict that had been developing for months in the depths beyond conventional military surveillance. And Maya Chun's unique capabilities were about to become the key to understanding threats that conventional naval warfare had never imagined possible. The ocean was calling, and for the first time in naval history, there were people ready to answer. In the language the depths had been speaking all along, Maya was halfway through packing her personal belongings when the emergency klaxon began its urgent wailing across Naval Special Warfare Command. She paused in folding her grandmother's jade pendant into tissue paper, listening to the specific pattern of short and long blasts that indicated underwater emergency response. Through her quarter's small window, she could see personnel running toward the harbor facilities with the controlled urgency that marked the Difference between training exercises and actual crisis. A sharp knock interrupted her packing. "Ma'am, Admiral Blackwood requests your immediate presence in the Emergency Operations Center." Maya opened the door to find Ensign Patricia Martinez, her young face flushed with the exertion of running across the base. Behind her expression of professional duty, Maya could detect something else. Curiosity that suggested word of the morning's pool demonstration had spread throughout the base personnel. "Ensign, I believe my assignment here has been terminated." "Ma'am." The Admiral was very specific. "He said to tell you that people are dying, and we need someone who can listen to what the water is saying." Maya set down the pendant and followed Martinez through corridors that buzzed with emergency activity. Personnel rushed past carrying diving equipment, medical supplies, and communication gear while overhead speakers provided continuous updates on an underwater crisis that was rapidly escalating beyond conventional response capabilities. The Emergency Operations Center was a maze of monitors, communication stations, and tactical displays that painted a picture of organized chaos. At the center of it all stood Admiral Blackwood, his earlier skepticism replaced by the grim focus of a commander facing a situation that threatened to overwhelm his available resources. "Miss Chen," he said without preamble as she entered, "we have a nuclear submarine in distress 2 miles offshore. Unknown classification. Crew complement unknown. Currently resting on a thermal shelf at 400 feet depth. Our standard rescue protocols are ineffective due to extreme current conditions and interference that's disabling our communication and sonar systems." Maya studied the tactical displays, her trained eye immediately picking up anomalies that went far beyond simple mechanical failure. "Admiral, this interference pattern. It's not random electromagnetic disturbance. There's a structure to it, almost like a language." Commander Torres looked up from his medical station where he was coordinating rescue medical protocols. "Ms. Chen, we've analyzed the acoustic signatures extensively. It's just oceanic white noise amplified by thermal layer interactions." "Commander," Maya said gently, approaching the sonar display station, "may I?" She placed her hands on the console and closed her eyes, her breathing deepening into the rhythm that had so unsettled the assembled officers earlier that morning. The cacophony of emergency activity seemed to fade around her as she focused on the acoustic pattern streaming through the facility's speakers. "There," she said after several minutes, her eyes still closed. "3 distinct sources of interference. The first is mechanical engine failure in the submarine's primary propulsion system. The second is environmental thermal inversion layer that's creating acoustic reflection patterns. But the third—" She opened her eyes and turned to face Admiral Blackwood with an expression that held depths of concern he hadn't expected. "Admiral, the third source isn't mechanical or environmental. It's biological. There's something large moving in the water around the submarine, something that's generating deliberate acoustic interference to prevent surface communication." Captain Chen looked up from his intelligence station with obvious skepticism. "Miss Chen, we've conducted extensive marine life surveys in this area. There's nothing large enough to generate the interference patterns we're detecting." "Captain, your surveys were conducted using conventional sonar and observation techniques. They would detect known marine life exhibiting expected behavioral patterns. What I'm hearing suggests intelligence, purpose, and capabilities that don't match any cataloged species." Chief Rodriguez entered the operations center with his SEAL team, their faces showing the unusual calm that had characterized their pool demonstration. "Admiral, we're ready for deployment, but we need more specific information about conditions at depth." Maya studied the team members, noting the subtle changes in their posture and breathing that indicated they had been practicing the techniques she'd demonstrated. Morrison in particular seemed transformed, his usual aggressive energy replaced by a stillness that suggested profound inner focus. "Chief," Maya said, "what you experienced in the pool this morning. You're feeling it now, aren't you? The pull of deep water, the sense that there's something down there calling for help. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Ma'am, it's like an itch I can't scratch. Every instinct I've developed over 22 years of diving is telling me that this isn't a standard mechanical failure. There's something more complex happening down there. Admiral Blackwood felt the familiar weight of command decisions that could determine life or death for unknown numbers of people. His training demanded adherence to established rescue protocols, deploy conventional diving teams with standard equipment, and attempt to establish communication through technological means. But the evidence before him suggested that conventional approaches might not only fail but could potentially make the situation worse. Miss Chen, he said finally, if you're correct about biological interference, what are you suggesting? Maya approached the central tactical display, her finger tracing the underwater topography that surrounded the distressed submarine. Admiral, the interference isn't random harassment, it's protection. Something is trying to shield the submarine from surface detection while keeping it stable on the thermal shelf. Whatever's down there, it's trying to help. Help? Colonel Stevens had arrived from the legal office, her prosecutor's instincts immediately suspicious of explanations that defied conventional military logic. Ms. Chen, you're suggesting that unknown marine life is conducting rescue operations? I'm suggesting that intelligence exists in the ocean depths that we've never acknowledged or understood. Intelligence that recognizes distress and responds with capabilities that surpass our technological solutions. Kim stepped forward from her position with the SEAL team. Ma'am, during our pool session this morning, we experienced something that felt like ... communication. Not verbal, not visual, but something deeper. Like the water itself was teaching us things our training never covered. Maya nodded, recognizing the dawning understanding in the medic's voice. Ms. Kim, what you experienced is what indigenous maritime cultures have known for thousands of years. The ocean isn't empty space between continents. It's a living system with its own intelligence, its own purposes, its own methods of supporting life in crisis. Tank Washington, who had remained silent during the briefing, suddenly spoke with uncharacteristic intensity. Ma'am, I can feel them. Right now, standing here 2 miles from the water, I can feel something large moving around that submarine. It's not threatening, it's protective. Like parents watching over children who've wandered too far from safety. The operations center fell silent except for the continuous stream of sonar data and emergency communications that painted an increasingly desperate picture of the submarine crisis. Time was running out for whoever was trapped in the depths, and conventional rescue approaches were proving inadequate for the unique challenges posed by the situation. Admiral, Maya said quietly, I need to go down there. Not with diving equipment or technological support, but using the techniques my grandmother taught me. The techniques that allowed the SEALs to function underwater this morning in ways their training never prepared them for. Commander Torres immediately protested. Ms. Chen, what you're proposing is suicide. 400 feet depth, extreme current. Conditions, unknown hazards, no human being can survive those conditions without proper life support equipment. Commander, this morning I demonstrated capabilities that your medical training insists are impossible. The SEAL team replicated those capabilities within hours of learning the basic techniques. We're not talking about defying physics, we're talking about utilizing human potential that conventional medicine hasn't acknowledged. Admiral Blackwood found himself facing the most difficult command decision of his career. Every protocol, every regulation, every principle of responsible military leadership demanded that he refuse Maya's request and proceed with conventional rescue attempts. But the evidence before him, the impossible capabilities demonstrated by his own personnel, the acoustic patterns that suggested intelligence beyond conventional understanding, the growing certainty that standard approaches would fail pointed toward a choice that challenged everything he thought he knew about command responsibility. "Miss Chen," he said finally, "if I authorize this mission, what exactly are you proposing?" Maya approached the tactical display and began outlining a rescue approach that drew on principles no military manual had ever codified. "I'll descend using traditional free diving techniques enhanced by the breathing and physiological control methods my grandmother taught me. At depth, I'll attempt to communicate with whatever intelligence is protecting the submarine and coordinate a rescue approach that works with rather than against the natural systems operating in that environment." "And if you're wrong?" Colonel Stevens asked. "If there's no mysterious intelligence, no protective marine life, no oceanic communication system? If you're simply experiencing delusions brought on by oxygen deprivation and psychological stress?" Maya met the colonel's skeptical gaze with calm certainty. "Then I'll perform a standard underwater reconnaissance of the submarine's condition and report back on rescue options using conventional methods." "But Colonel, if I'm right, if there are intelligences in the ocean depths that can assist with rescue operations beyond our technological capabilities, then we have an opportunity to save lives using methods that could revolutionize underwater emergency response." Chief Rodriguez stepped forward. "Admiral, request permission to accompany Miss Chen on this mission. My team has been practicing her techniques, and we're prepared to provide support using enhanced underwater capabilities." "Chief, what you demonstrated in the pool this morning was impressive, but this is 400 feet of ocean depth under extreme conditions." "The margin for error is, sir," Morrison interrupted, something he had never done in his military career. "The margin for error using conventional approaches is 0. We've already lost 2 rescue attempts due to equipment failure and current conditions. Whatever Ms. Chen is proposing, it can't be less effective than what we've already tried." Admiral Blackwood looked around the operations center at faces that reflected a mixture of desperation, hope, and the kind of professional readiness that characterized military personnel facing impossible odds. The acoustic displays continued their urgent stream of data from the depths, while communication attempts with the distressed submarine yielded only static and silence. "Authorization granted," he said finally. "But this mission proceeds under full medical monitoring with surface support teams standing by, and with abort protocols that I will not hesitate to invoke if conditions become untenable." Maya nodded, already beginning the breathing exercises that would prepare her for depths that conventional diving physiology insisted would kill her within minutes. "Admiral, there's one more thing you need to understand. Once we descend and make contact with the intelligence that's protecting that submarine, everything you think you know about naval warfare and underwater operations is going to change forever." As Maya and the SEAL team prepared for a rescue mission that would challenge every principle of underwater survival they had been taught, the acoustic signatures from the depths began to shift into patterns that suggested recognition, anticipation, and something that could only be described as welcome. The ocean was preparing to reveal secrets that would transform not only the immediate crisis, but the fundamental understanding of what lay beneath the waves that had defined naval warfare for centuries. And Maya Chen, carrying the ancient knowledge of her grandmother and the desperate hope of trapped submariners, was about to become the bridge between 2 worlds that had never truly met until this moment. The descent began at precisely 1347 hours, with Maya leading the way into depths that should have crushed human consciousness within minutes. But as she slipped beneath the Pacific surface, followed by Chief Rodriguez and his team, something extraordinary began to unfold, a demonstration of human potential that would reshape naval special warfare doctrine for generations to come. At 50 feet, conventional diving physiology demanded that Maya begin managing nitrogen narcosis and pressure equalization through technological assistance. Instead, she moved through the water with the fluid grace of something born to it, her breathing rhythm synchronized with currents that seemed to guide her descent rather than resist it. Behind her, the SEAL team followed with movements that had been transformed by their morning training session, no longer fighting against the ocean, but flowing with it in ways their instructors had never imagined possible. Admiral Blackwood monitored their progress from the surface command vessel, watching sonar displays that painted an impossible picture. "Commander Torres, what are you reading on their vital signs?" Torres studied his medical monitors with the expression of a man watching his fundamental understanding of human physiology crumble in real time. "Sir, heart rates are stabilizing between 25 and 30 beats per minute across the entire team. Oxygen saturation is holding steady at levels that should indicate brain death. According to every medical protocol I know, they should have lost consciousness 2 minutes ago. And yet they're functioning normally? Sir, they're functioning better than normally. Their coordination, their swimming efficiency, their apparent cognitive function, everything is enhanced beyond baseline measurements." At 150 feet, Maya began to sense the presence that had been protecting the distressed submarine. It wasn't visible to conventional sonar, but her grandmother's training had taught her to perceive patterns in water temperature, pressure, and current flow that revealed information beyond technological detection. Something vast and intelligent was moving through the depths ahead, its presence creating subtle environmental changes that spoke of awareness, purpose, and ancient knowledge. Rodriguez felt it too, the same instinctive recognition that had saved his team in Somalia 6 years earlier. "Ma'am," he said through the underwater communication system, "I'm getting that feeling again. Like something is guiding us toward the submarine rather than us finding it ourselves." Maya nodded, though the gesture was barely visible in the deep blue twilight that surrounded them at depth. "Chief, what you're feeling is communication. Not verbal, not visual, but something deeper. Let it guide you, but don't try to control or direct it. We're guests here, not conquerors." At 250 feet, they encountered the thermal layer that had been disrupting conventional rescue attempts. But instead of the chaotic temperature variations that sonar had detected, Maya found herself moving through organized columns of warm and cold water that created pathways through the ocean like underwater highways. The thermal layer wasn't random environmental condition, it was architecture, designed by intelligence that understood three-dimensional navigation in ways that human engineering had never contemplated. Kim swam beside Morrison, her medical training warring with experiences that challenged everything she thought she knew about underwater survival. "Staff Sergeant, are you seeing this? The way the water is moving around us, it's like we're being carried rather than swimming." Morrison, who had spent his career forcing his way through water resistance with brute strength and determination, found himself experiencing the ocean as a supportive environment rather than hostile territory. "It's like the water wants us to succeed. Like it's actively helping us reach the submarine instead of trying to kill us for being here." At 350 feet, they found the submarine. The vessel rested on a thermal shelf that created a pocket of stable water in the midst of chaotic current conditions. But it wasn't alone. Surrounding the submarine, moving with purposes that suggested both intelligence and benevolence, were forms that defied conventional marine biology classification. Not whales, not sharks, not any catalog species, but something that seemed to exist in the spaces between categories. Creatures of impossible size and grace that moved through the water like living architecture. "Jesus Christ," Tank Washington whispered, his massive frame dwarfed by intelligences that seemed to stretch into the blue-black depths beyond visibility. "They're protecting it. They're actually protecting the submarine from current damage." Maya swam forward, her movements triggering responses from the guardian creatures that confirmed her grandmother's teachings about oceanic consciousness and communication. The forms around the submarine shifted to create clear passages toward the vessel's hull, while simultaneously maintaining the environmental barriers that kept it stable on the thermal shelf. As Maya approached the submarine's conning tower, she began to understand the true nature of the crisis. The vessel wasn't simply disabled by mechanical failure, it was a research submarine, from an unknown nation that had been studying the same oceanic intelligences that Maya had learned to communicate with. But their approach had been technological rather than intuitive, using sonar and electromagnetic equipment that the guardian creatures perceived as threatening rather than communicative. "Admiral," Maya reported through her communication system. "The submarine crew's alive, but they're trapped not by mechanical failure, but by misunderstanding. They've been using acoustic equipment that the protective intelligences interpret as hostile. The interference patterns we detected aren't random. They're attempts to disable what the creatures perceive as weapons." From the surface command vessel, Admiral Blackwood felt his understanding of naval warfare shifting beneath him like sand. "Miss Chen, are you telling me that unknown marine life has been conducting defensive operations against submarine reconnaissance?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Sir, I'm telling you that intelligence exists in the ocean depths that perceives aggressive sonar scanning the same way we might perceive someone pointing weapons at our children. The submarine crew isn't being attacked, they're being contained until they stop what the Guardians perceive as hostile behavior." Rodriguez had reached the submarine's hull and was attempting to establish communication with the trapped crew through conventional knocking patterns. But Maya gestured for him to stop, swimming closer to the nearest guardian creature and extending her hand in the greeting gesture her grandmother had taught her, palm open, fingers relaxed, movement flowing rather than aggressive. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The creature, easily 50 feet in length but moving with the delicacy of a hummingbird, approached Maya with curiosity rather than threat. When it made contact, the briefest touch of what might have been a sensory organ against her extended palm, Maya's consciousness exploded with information. Images flooded her awareness: thermal maps of ocean currents, acoustic signatures of submarine movements, electromagnetic patterns that revealed technological intrusion into spaces that had known only natural rhythms for millions of years. But more than information, she received emotional context: the Guardians' confusion about creatures that moved through their territory using tools that seemed designed for aggression rather than communication. "I understand," Maya whispered, her words somehow carrying through the water to the assembled intelligences. "You don't understand why they're making those sounds. You think they're trying to hurt you." The response came not in words but in direct comprehension, a download of oceanic perspective that revealed the submarine crisis as a first contact situation rather than a mechanical emergency. The research vessel had been mapping thermal layers and acoustic patterns in an attempt to understand the same phenomena that Maya's grandmother's people had been communicating with for generations. But their technological approach had triggered defensive responses from intelligences that perceived electromagnetic scanning as hostile intrusion. Maya turned to Rodriguez, her eyes bright with understanding that seemed to illuminate the depths around them. "Chief, I need you to signal the submarine crew. Tell them to shut down all acoustic and electromagnetic equipment. Everything. The Guardians will release them once they stop what's being perceived as aggressive behavior." Rodriguez nodded and swam to the submarine's communication port, tapping out a message in International Maritime Code. "Shut down all electronic systems. Repeat. Shut down all electronic systems. You are safe but must cease acoustic activity immediately." The response from within the submarine came quickly, a series of taps that indicated understanding and compliance. Within minutes, the electromagnetic interference that had been disrupting surface communication began to fade, and the Guardian creatures started to withdraw their protective formations around the vessel. But Maya wasn't finished. Swimming closer to the submarine's main hatch, she placed her hand against the hull and closed her eyes, extending her consciousness through the metal barrier to the frightened crew members within. What she found was a team of marine biologists and acoustics researchers who had been studying oceanic anomalies for months. documenting intelligence signatures that suggested complex social structures among unknown deep-sea species. Admiral, Maya reported, the submarine crew consists of researchers studying the same phenomena we've encountered. They've been documenting evidence of oceanic intelligence for months, but their technological approach triggered defensive responses. They're not hostile, they're scientists who stumbled into a first contact situation without understanding the communication protocols. From the surface, Admiral Blackwood coordinated rescue operations that would bring the submarine crew to safety, while beginning to process the implications of what his teams had discovered in the depths. But Maya remained at depth, swimming among the guardian creatures with movements that seemed to belong more to their world than to the surface realm. She had left behind Dot as the submarine began its controlled ascent, guided by currents that the guardian creatures modified to ensure safe passage. Maya found herself surrounded by intelligences that had waited generations for someone to bridge the gap between oceanic and surface consciousness. The creatures that her grandmother had called the Deep Ones, not monsters or threats, but ancient guardians of oceanic balance, who had watched human technology intrude into their realm with growing concern, through touch and presence rather than words. Maya began to understand their perspective. For decades, they had observed human submarine activity with confusion and growing alarm. The aggressive sonar scanning, the electromagnetic interference, the chemical pollutants, all of it had been perceived as increasingly hostile behavior. From surface creatures that seemed determined to disrupt oceanic harmony. But Maya's presence, and her demonstration of communication techniques that recognized oceanic intelligence as legitimate rather than primitive, opened possibilities for cooperation that neither species had previously imagined. The Guardians began sharing information about thermal currents, acoustic patterns, and underwater navigation techniques that could revolutionize human underwater operations while respecting the natural systems that had evolved over millions of years. When Maya finally surfaced 3 hours later, followed by the SEAL team and the rescued submarine crew, she carried with her knowledge that would transform naval special warfare doctrine. But more importantly, she carried the foundation for an ongoing relationship between human and oceanic intelligence that could reshape humanity's relationship with the ocean itself. Admiral Blackwood met them at the harbor with a mixture of relief and profound uncertainty about how to process what his personnel had experienced. The rescued submarine crew, Dr. Elena Vasquez, and her team of marine researchers provided corroborating evidence of oceanic intelligence that challenged every assumption about marine life and underwater environment that naval doctrine had been built upon. Admiral, Dr. Vasquez said as she stepped onto the dock, her face showing the strain of hours trapped underwater, but her eyes bright with scientific excitement. What we experience down there, it changes everything. We've been studying oceanic intelligence signatures for months, but we never understood that our research methods were being perceived as hostile. Ms. Chen demonstrated communication techniques that suggest the possibility of cooperative rather than intrusive research approaches. Maya stood on the dock, still dripping seawater, but somehow seeming more at home than she had in any land-based environment. Admiral, this is just the beginning. The Guardians have been waiting for someone who could serve as translator between human and oceanic intelligence. They have knowledge about underwater navigation, resource management, and environmental balance that could solve problems we didn't even know we had. Chief Rodriguez and his team gathered around Maya with expressions that mixed exhaustion with something approaching reverence. Their descent and rescue mission had transformed not only their understanding of underwater operations, but their fundamental relationship with the ocean itself. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his usual aggressive confidence replaced by quiet wonder. "What we experience down there, it's going to take time to process. But I know one thing for certain, everything we thought we knew about underwater warfare just became obsolete." Kim nodded, her medical training struggling to explain physiological capabilities she had personally experienced. The breathing techniques, the pressure adaptation, the way our bodies responded to depth, it's like we discovered organs we never knew we had. Capabilities that were always there but never accessed. Tank Washington, who had spent his career using brute force to overcome underwater challenges, spoke with uncharacteristic softness. It's like the ocean was teaching us how to be better at being human. Not fighting against our limitations, but discovering that our limitations were artificial to begin with. Admiral Blackwood looked at the assembled personnel, the SEAL team whose capabilities had been transformed overnight, the rescued researchers whose work would revolutionize marine science, and Maya Chen, whose presence had bridged worlds that had never successfully communicated before. "Miss Chen," he said finally, "I believe I owe you an apology. And I believe the Navy owes you something more than an apology." Maya smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the base, her expression held the peace of someone who had found her true purpose. "Admiral, the ocean doesn't want apologies. It wants partnership. And I think today we took the first step toward building a relationship that could benefit both human and oceanic intelligence for generations to come." But Maya's words proved more prophetic than even she realized. The rescue mission and first contact with oceanic intelligence marked the beginning of changes that would ripple through naval warfare, marine science, and humanity's understanding of its place in the oceanic world. Within 6 months, Naval Special Warfare Command had established the Oceanic Communication Research Division, with Maya Chen as its director and Chief Rodriguez's team as its first operational unit. The techniques Maya had demonstrated were refined and taught to selected personnel, creating the world's first truly amphibious military specialists humans, who could operate underwater with capabilities that bridged the gap between surface and oceanic consciousness. The guardian creatures, through ongoing communication with Maya and her team, began sharing knowledge that revolutionized underwater navigation, search and rescue operations, and environmental monitoring. Submarine accidents became virtually extinct as naval forces learned to coordinate with oceanic intelligences that could guide vessels through dangerous conditions with precision. No technology could match. Dr. Vasquez's research team, working in cooperation with the guardian creatures rather than studying them as subjects, made discoveries about oceanic ecosystems that led to breakthrough advances in marine conservation and sustainable resource management. The aggressive sonar and electromagnetic scanning that had triggered the original crisis was replaced by communication protocols that allowed human research to proceed with oceanic consent and cooperation. But perhaps most importantly, Maya's demonstration of human potential unlocked capabilities that transformed not just military operations, but human understanding of consciousness itself. The breathing techniques, physiological control methods, and communication abilities that her grandmother had preserved through generations of oral tradition became the foundation for a new understanding of human potential that extended far beyond underwater applications. Military academies began teaching courses in oceanic communication alongside traditional navigation and tactics. Medical schools started researching the physiological adaptations that allowed humans to function at impossible depths and heart rates. And around the world, indigenous maritime cultures that had preserved similar knowledge for generations found themselves suddenly respected as keepers of wisdom that could benefit all humanity. Maya Chen, the quiet intelligence analyst who had arrived at Coronado as an unwelcome outsider, had become the architect of a new era in human-oceanic relations. But more than that, she had demonstrated that the boundaries between possible and impossible were far more flexible than anyone had dared to imagine. Standing on the dock in the golden light of the Pacific sunset, surrounded by personnel whose lives and capabilities had been forever transformed by their encounter with oceanic intelligence, Maya felt the satisfaction of someone who had found her true calling. The ocean whispered its ancient secrets to those willing to listen. And finally, humanity was ready to hear. 3 years later, the auditorium at the Naval Academy was packed beyond capacity, with naval officers, marine scientists, and representatives from maritime cultures around the world gathering to witness what many considered the most significant advancement in naval warfare since the invention of sonar. At the podium stood Maya Chen, no longer the quiet intelligence analyst who had been dismissed as delusional, but Admiral Maya Chen, the youngest woman ever to achieve flag rank and the director of humanity's first successful interspecies military cooperation program. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maya began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her trademark. 3 years ago, we believed that the ocean was empty space to be conquered through technological superiority. Today, we understand that the ocean is a living partner whose cooperation has revolutionized everything we thought we knew about underwater operations. The presentation screen behind her displayed footage that would have been dismissed as fabricated. Just years earlier, SEAL teams moving through ocean depths with grace that surpassed marine life. Submarines navigating treacherous waters, guided by intelligences that existed beyond human comprehension. Rescue operations conducted in conditions that conventional technology couldn't access. In the front row sat Chief Rodriguez, now Captain Rodriguez, whose transformation from skeptical special operations veteran to the Navy's leading expert in oceanic cooperation had become legendary throughout Naval Special Warfare Command. Beside him sat Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose research collaboration with the guardian creatures had produced scientific breakthroughs that were reshaping marine biology and environmental science. "The Oceanic Communication Protocol," Maya continued, "has not only eliminated submarine accidents in the Pacific Fleet area of operations, but has also enabled rescue missions that were previously impossible. Last month alone, our oceanic partners guided rescue teams to 7 vessels in distress, saving 847 lives in conditions that would have been fatal using conventional approaches." Staff Sergeant Morrison, now Lieutenant Morrison, and one of the program's most accomplished practitioners, stood at the back of the auditorium with his new team of oceanic communication specialists. The aggressive young soldier who had initially challenged Maya with crude bets had evolved into a teacher whose underwater capabilities inspired a new generation of naval personnel to expand their understanding of human potential. Maya clicked to the next slide, showing thermal maps of ocean currents that revealed patterns invisible to conventional technology. But perhaps more importantly, our partnership with oceanic intelligence has revealed environmental threats that our instruments never detected. Chemical pollution patterns, temperature changes, and ecosystem disruptions that the guardian creatures have been monitoring for decades are now accessible to human environmental protection efforts. In the audience, Admiral Blackwood watched with the pride of a commander whose willingness to trust unconventional solutions had transformed not only his base, but the entire paradigm of naval operations. The decision to authorize Maya's impossible rescue mission had been vindicated beyond his wildest expectations, leading to innovations that placed his command at the forefront of military evolution. Maya advanced to a slide, showing graduation statistics from the Naval Academy's new Oceanic Communication Program. This year, we graduated our first class of officers trained in cooperative underwater operations. These men and women can function at depths and for durations that redefine human underwater capability. But more importantly, they understand that strength comes not from conquering the ocean, but from earning its trust. Sarah Kim, now Commander Kim, and the program's chief medical officer, had documented physiological changes in oceanic communication practitioners that challenged fundamental assumptions about human biology. Heart rates that could safely drop to levels previously associated with coma, lung capacity that expanded beyond known limits, and pressure adaptation that eliminated decompression requirements, all achieved through techniques that indigenous maritime cultures had preserved for Generations. The implications extend far beyond military applications, Maya said, her presentation moving to images of civilian search and rescue operations, marine conservation efforts, and scientific research projects that had been revolutionized by oceanic cooperation. Commercial shipping routes guided by oceanic intelligence have reduced both transit times and environmental impact. Marine protected areas monitored by guardian creatures have shown ecosystem recovery rates that exceed our most optimistic projections. Tank Washington, now Master Chief Washington and the program's senior enlisted advisor, had become an advocate for recruiting personnel from indigenous maritime communities whose ancestral knowledge provided the foundation for oceanic communication techniques. His own transformation from skeptical giant to gentle teacher embodied the program's success in changing not just capabilities but fundamental attitudes about human environment. Relationships. Maya paused her presentation to address the question that she knew was foremost in everyone's minds. You're wondering about the implications for naval warfare, about how oceanic cooperation affects military advantage and strategic balance. The answer is that warfare itself is being transformed. The next slides showed joint exercises between naval forces and oceanic intelligences, demonstrating capabilities that no individual military could match. Submarines that could navigate through underwater terrain at speeds that defied physics, guided by creatures whose three-dimensional awareness surpassed any artificial intelligence. Special operations teams that could infiltrate coastal targets through underwater approaches that left no technological signature, supported by guardians who could modify current patterns to conceal their movement. Nations that embrace oceanic cooperation gain capabilities that cannot be countered by conventional military technology, Maya explained. But more importantly, oceanic intelligence doesn't recognize human political boundaries. The guardian creatures evaluate cooperation based on environmental responsibility and peaceful intent rather than national allegiance. This is creating a form of natural peacekeeping that transcends traditional military concepts. In the audience, representatives from navies around the world took notes that would reshape their own underwater doctrines. The competitive advantage that oceanic cooperation provided was so significant that nations were being forced to choose between aggressive environmental policies and military effectiveness, a choice that was gradually shifting global priorities towards sustainability and cooperation. Maya's presentation concluded with footage from the most recent oceanic communication exercise, showing the impossible. Humans and guardian creatures working together in formations that looked more like underwater ballet than military operations. Personnel moving through the depths with capabilities that made traditional diving equipment seem primitive, supported by intelligences whose understanding of three-dimensional underwater navigation had evolved over millions of years. The ocean covers 71% of our planet's surface, Maya said in conclusion. For centuries, we've treated it as empty space to be crossed or hostile territory to be conquered. Now we understand that it's been waiting for us to grow up enough to become partners in its stewardship. The techniques I demonstrated 3 years ago weren't the end of human underwater evolution. They were the beginning. As the presentation ended and the audience erupted in sustained applause, Maya felt the satisfaction of someone who had found her true calling. But her greatest pride wasn't in the military innovations or scientific breakthroughs that had resulted from oceanic cooperation. It was in the transformed individuals who had learned to see the ocean not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a teacher whose lessons could unlock human potential that conventional education had never imagined possible. 5 years later, the International Maritime Cooperation Conference convened in San Francisco, Maya's childhood home, where representatives from every major naval force and maritime nation had gathered to establish protocols for oceanic intelligence relations that would govern human interaction with the sea for generations to come. Maya stood on the deck of the Conference venue: a research vessel anchored in San Francisco Bay, where the Pacific Ocean met the waters of her grandmother's Pearl River Delta heritage. She wore the uniform of the newly established United Nations Oceanic Cooperation Command, an organization that transcended national boundaries to coordinate humanity's relationship with the intelligences that govern the seas. My grandmother used to tell me that the ocean remembers everything, Maya said, addressing delegates who represented over 50 nations and dozens of indigenous maritime cultures. Today, we're creating memories that the ocean will carry forward for centuries. Memories of cooperation instead of conquest, partnership instead of domination. The protocols they were establishing would regulate everything from commercial shipping routes to scientific research, ensuring that human oceanic activities proceeded with the consent and cooperation of the guardian creatures, whose stewardship had maintained oceanic balance for millions of years. Nations that violated these protocols would find their vessels unable to navigate efficiently, their underwater operations mysteriously unsuccessful, their coastal waters increasingly turbulent. Captain Rodriguez, now the commanding officer of the world's first truly amphibious military unit, had spent the past 5 years training personnel from dozens of nations in oceanic communication techniques. His students had returned to their home countries as seeds of transformation, spreading knowledge that was gradually shifting global maritime culture away from exploitation toward cooperation. The economic implications had been staggering. Shipping companies that embraced oceanic cooperation found their vessels guided through optimal routes by intelligences that understood current patterns and weather systems with precision no computer could match. Fuel consumption dropped by an average of 30%, while safety incidents became virtually extinct in waters where guardian creatures provided navigation assistance. Dr. Vasquez's research teams, working in full partnership with Oceanic Intelligence, had made discoveries that revolutionized understanding of marine ecosystems, climate regulation, and environmental balance. The guardian creatures possessed knowledge of ocean chemistry, thermodynamics, and biological relationships that dated back millions of years, information that proved crucial for addressing climate change and environmental degradation. But perhaps most significantly, the program had sparked a global renaissance in human potential research. Maya's demonstration that humans could function underwater with capabilities that seemed impossible had opened investigations into other supposedly fixed limitations of human physiology and consciousness. Around the world, researchers were discovering that boundaries between possible and impossible were far more flexible than anyone had imagined. The Oceanic Communication Academy in Coronado had become the most prestigious military training institution in the world, with graduation requirements that included not only technical proficiency, but demonstrated ability to communicate with oceanic intelligence. Its graduates, known as depth speakers, were sought after by every major naval force and had become the elite of elite underwater specialists. Maya's most profound satisfaction came from watching former skeptics become evangelists for oceanic cooperation. Morrison, now Colonel Morrison and the Academy's Director of Advanced Underwater Tactics, had written the definitive manual on oceanic communication protocols. His transformation from aggressive challenger to gentle teacher embodied the program's success in changing not just capabilities but fundamental attitudes about human-environment relationships. 10 years later, the ceremony at Pearl Harbor marked the 10th anniversary of the first oceanic communication contact, with Maya delivering the keynote address to an audience that included heads of state, environmental leaders, and indigenous elders whose ancestral knowledge had provided the foundation for humanity's partnership with the sea. 10 years ago, Maya began, standing on the deck of the USS Chen, the first vessel designed specifically for oceanic cooperation, named in honor of her grandmother's lineage and equipped with communication systems that interfaced directly with guardian creature sensory networks. We thought the ocean was our enemy to be conquered. Today, we understand that it was always our ancestor, waiting for us to remember our origins and reclaim our place in the family of oceanic life. The global transformation had exceeded even her most optimistic projections. Nations that embraced oceanic cooperation had achieved maritime safety records that approached perfection, while their fishing industries operated in sustainable harmony with marine ecosystems, guided by intelligences that understood population dynamics across geological timescales. Countries that attempted to maintain aggressive oceanic policies found their vessels increasingly unwelcome in international waters, their coastal economies suffering as guardian creatures redirected currents and marine life away from exploitative practices. The military implications had created a new form of international balance based on environmental responsibility rather than technological superiority. Nations competed not to build more destructive weapons, but to achieve higher levels of oceanic cooperation, understanding that true security came from partnership with the Singfam, intelligences that controlled the majority of the planet's surface. Kim, now Admiral Kim and the Surgeon General of the Oceanic Cooperation Command, had documented human evolutionary changes that suggested the species was adapting in real time to its renewed partnership with the sea. Children born to oceanic communication practitioners showed enhanced underwater capabilities from birth, while adults who practiced the techniques experienced improvements in lung capacity, pressure tolerance, and what could only be described as intuitive navigation abilities. The techniques my grandmother taught me weren't just individual skills. Maya continued, her voice carrying across the harbor to thousands of listeners who represented a new generation of maritime professionals. They were the beginning of humanity's return to its oceanic origins, the first steps in an evolutionary journey that's transforming our species' relationship with the planet itself. The presentation concluded with footage from the latest oceanic cooperation exercises, showing capabilities that would have been dismissed as fantasy just a decade earlier. Underwater cities where humans and guardian creatures work together to monitor and maintain oceanic health. Research stations that operated at depths previously accessible only to robotic systems, staffed by personnel whose capabilities bridge the gap between surface and oceanic consciousness. Rescue operations that could reach any point in the world's oceans within hours, guided by intelligence networks that spanned the globe. 20 years later, Maya Chen, now Fleet Admiral Chen and the architect of humanity's most successful interspecies partnership, stood in her office overlooking San Francisco Bay, where her grandmother had first taught her to listen to the ocean's voice. The jade pendant that had belonged to generations of Pearl River Delta women rested on her desk, but now it was accompanied by gifts from guardian creatures around the world, objects of impossible beauty created in oceanic depths and presented to the human who had bridged two worlds. The transformation was complete. Humanity had evolved from a terrestrial species that feared the ocean to an amphibious civilization that thrived in partnership with oceanic intelligence. Children learned to swim before they could walk, and swimming meant communicating with guardian creatures who served as teachers, guides, and protectors in the underwater realm that now served as humanity's second home. The environmental crisis that had threatened to destroy oceanic ecosystems had been reversed through cooperation with intelligences that understood planetary systems across geological timescales. The guardian creatures had shared knowledge of climate regulation, chemical balance, and biological diversity that enabled humans to become stewards rather than exploiters of the planet's resources. Maya's greatest pride was in the transformed individuals who had learned to see limitations as invitations to growth rather than boundaries to accept. The young SEALs who had initially dismissed her with crude bets had become leaders of a movement that redefined human potential. Their students and their students carried forward techniques that unlocked capabilities humans had possessed all along but had forgotten how to access. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson, that seemed to dance with the movement of guardian creatures just beneath the surface. Maya felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had found her true purpose. The ocean whispered its ancient secrets to those willing to listen, and humanity had finally learned to hear. The bet that had started it all, whether a quiet analyst could swim 10 laps without stopping, had evolved into a partnership that spanned the globe and transformed a species. Maya had not only broken their underwater record by hours, she had broken the barriers between human and oceanic consciousness that had separated Earth's dominant species from its planetary partner for millennia. The waves lapped against the shore with the eternal rhythm that had called Maya home decades earlier, carrying messages of cooperation, understanding, and infinite possibility. The ocean remembered everything, and now humanity's memory included the knowledge that limitations existed only in the minds of those who had forgotten their connection to the vast intelligence that covered most of their world. In the depths beyond the harbor, guardian creatures moved in formations that could only be described as celebration. Their ancient intelligence finally joined by partners who understood that true strength came not from conquering the ocean, but from earning its trust and learning its wisdom. Maya Chen smiled as she prepared to leave her office for the day, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, and new opportunities to deepen humanity's partnership with the sea. The ocean was calling, as it always had, and finally, humanity was ready to answer with the respect and understanding that had been waiting for generations to emerge. The last light of sunset reflected off the jade pendant on her desk, carrying forward the wisdom of ancestors who had always known that the ocean was not humanity's enemy, but its oldest teacher and truest home. Maya's story continued to unfold across decades of transformation, as the quiet intelligence analyst who had once been dismissed for impossible claims became the architect of humanity's greatest evolutionary leap. The techniques she had demonstrated in a single pool had rippled outward to reshape civilization itself, proving that the greatest changes often begin with a single person willing to remember what others have forgotten. Oceanic partnership that began with a bet among Navy SEALs had evolved into a global transformation that touched every aspect of human civilization. From environmental restoration to technological innovation, from military strategy to spiritual awakening, the cooperation between human and oceanic intelligence had created possibilities that neither species could have achieved alone. Children, who grew up learning to communicate with guardian creatures as naturally as they learned to speak, developed capabilities that their grandparents would have considered miraculous. They could navigate underwater terrain with instincts that surpassed technological guidance, understand weather patterns through sensory connections to oceanic systems, and approach environmental challenges with wisdom drawn from millions of years of planetary stewardship. The military applications had created a new form of international stability, based on environmental cooperation rather than destructive competition. Nations that maintained aggressive policies toward oceanic resources found themselves increasingly isolated, while countries that embraced partnership with guardian creatures gained capabilities that made traditional naval warfare obsolete. Maya's legacy was not just the techniques she had preserved and shared, but the fundamental shift in human consciousness that recognized the ocean as partner rather than resource, teacher rather than obstacle, family rather than stranger. The bet that had challenged her swimming ability had become a challenge to humanity itself, to remember its oceanic origins and reclaim its place in the planetary community that had been waiting for its return. As waves continued their eternal dance along coastlines around the world, they carried forward the story of a woman who had listened when the ocean called, answered when it taught, and shared when it blessed her with wisdom that transformed the species' relationship with its planetary home. The ocean remembered everything, and now its memory included the story of Maya Chen, the quiet analyst who had proven that impossible was just another word for forgotten, and that the greatest discoveries often lay not in conquering new territory, but in remembering the wisdom that had been waiting all along in the depths of the world's memory.